China. It's the issue that will dominate global politics for many, many years to come. It's been another really big week. Great news on the face of it that Boris Johnson has reversed his decision over allowing Huawei to be part of the 5G network. Now, this is big news because Boris has declared himself to be a Sinophile. Indeed, many members of his own family and, of course, of the governing Conservative Party, people he was at Oxford with, have believed that China is our future. So for Boris to announce that from the end of this year, there's no more Huawei putting new kit into our 5G network is a big, and I think welcome, political U-turn. And it's a big victory. The newspapers say it's Donald Trump's victory. Well, of course, Donald Trump is a part of it. But the reality is, on this issue, Boris had completely lost control of his backbenchers. And I suppose mentioned in dispatches, people like Ian Duncan Smith, Bob Seeley, the Isle of Wight, Tory MP, they've been very, very prominent in pushing for Huawei to be removed. However, there is a bit of a sting in the tail, which is that the kit that's been put in by the end of this year, and bear in mind, that's another 5.5 months for Huawei to sell kit to British cell phone providers. Now, okay, the Americans have put some sanctions in place. That may well reduce the ability of the Chinese to make this stuff, but they've been installing this since the middle of 2019, and the kit will remain in place until 2027, which means if they do have, and we don't know the answer to this, but we have seen their form in previous times, if they're able to spy in any way on us, they'll be able to do it until 2027. So far from excluding Huawei from our 5G network, they'll be in it to a greater or lesser extent until 2027, by which time 6G will have come along anyway. Now, the people lobbying for Huawei kit to stay until 2027 were, of course, the big mobile cell phone providers themselves. They are Huawei's biggest champion. Why? Well, I'll do this in more depth another time, but basically, the whole model on which the mobile phone market works is broken. We sell off spectrum, and we do it to the retailers. It should be a wholesale market like gas and electricity. And because you're selling spectrum to O2 and Vodafone and firms like this, they have to buy some. So ever since the late 1990s, the prices for this spectrum have been way, way more than they should be. But of course, if you're Vodafone, you haven't got any spectrum, you cease to exist as a company, as opposed to in a wholesale market, it would be much more easily traded. So from the late 90s, we've seen our mobile phone providers with massive amounts of debt because they paid so much to get spectrum. And that's where the Chinese come in. In fact, you may think of Huawei as being a provider of technology, but they're just as much a finance house, backed, of course, by the Chinese Communist Party. So you want to buy some kit? That's great. Not only is the price cheap, but you've got to put no money up front at all. You'll get interest-free terms for 10 years or more. That is why those providers were lobbying Boris Johnson as hard as they were to keep the kit in until 2027. It's almost like they've become drug dependent upon Huawei. Now, I've, over the last 6 months, studied the telecoms market. I'd never understood it before. It is broken, whether it's 3G or 5G, 4G, 6G, whatever it is, each time we're told it's a revolution in mobile phone technology that will completely change our lives. And yet, anywhere outside London, in much of it, unless you hang onto an oak tree with 1 foot off the ground, you can't get a mobile phone signal. Rural connectivity is, from what I can see of it travelling around the country, no better than it was 20 years ago. And my phone cuts out regularly driving round Westminster. We've got very bad connectivity. We've got inflated prices. The whole model needs to change. As I say, more on that over the course of the next week or two. But at least Boris shifted on China. Now, something happened this week. There was on Radio 4 a documentary called The Briefing Room, put out, chaired by David Aronovich, left-of-centre commentator. Now, I'm not normally a great friend, politically speaking, of David Aronovich. Not a great believer in Radio 4 or the BBC. I mean, frankly, why the hell we're all paying him 157 quid a year is beyond me. But it was a really good documentary. It was about the plight of the Uighurs in China. And I have to say, much as I knew they were being persecuted with the Chinese authorities, I had got no idea the extent of it. Up to 1.5 million out of a population of 12 million have been put in re-education camps over the course of the last decade. There, they're told or made or forced to renounce their Sunni Muslim religion. There they are forced or made to bow to the great God of President Xi. Whilst the men are away at these re-education camps, the Chinese state place inside their houses for several days a month a man that works for the state, who then spies on the family, tries to get them to make indiscretions about the Chinese government and the loss of their husband or brother who is currently away being re-educated. Those who fail to be re-educated are simply imprisoned. And of the families who are not seen to be sufficiently compliant, the young women are compulsorily sterilised. That's right, they are compulsorily sterilised. I have to say, I hadn't realised the drop in the Uyghur population was a direct result of this being done by the Chinese Communist Party, but it's there and it is happening. And perhaps most shockingly of all, you might finish up being re-educated. You might finish up going to prison. You might finish up with somebody from the Communist Party being put to live in your house with you. But if you go out into the street, it might be even worse, because the evidence given by witnesses was that in Chinese cities, in the Xinjiang province, there are in places police blocks every couple of 100 yards or so that have video and audio listening and visual devices. So even what you say, is likely to get you into real trouble. Now, Charles Parton took part in this Radio 4 programme, former British diplomat in China, and he made it very clear that the Public Security Bureau had given an award to a company that had helped provide the kit to spy on the Uighurs. Any guesses what the name of that firm might be? Yeah, you've got it. It's Huawei. So it was a really very, very powerful documentary. It's called The Briefing Room, the programme. It's available on podcast. If you've got 28 minutes, it really is worth listening to. Yeah, Nigel Farage recommended the BBC. Well, look, amongst their vast output, amongst all their woke content, I guess some of it somewhere had to be good, and this really is. And yet I was shocked. How is it, when this programme was put out on Thursday, that no other part of the BBC had even touched upon it? And the same goes, extraordinarily, for the China Tribunal. Now, this reported a few weeks ago, it's an independent, British made-up tribunal headed by Sir Geoffrey Nice. And they've been looking at the plight of the Falun Gong. Now, their conclusions are stunning. I'll give you the summary. It says that forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience has been practiced on a substantial number of people for a very long period of time. Now, I feel a bit guilty about this because for nearly 15 years, every single month, on the migration to Strasbourg as an MEP, my office faced outside the building to a piece of grass that was just outside the Parliament. And every month, the Falun Gong movement, from these are expat Chinese dissidents, every month they were there playing their music. It's strange, eerie music. And I used to be really frustrated with them. I used to shut the window because the music would put me off working. And I was lobbied, and I met them a few times in my office, and they kept telling me about forced organ donation. Basically, state murder. And you know something? I did nothing. I don't think really very many people in Strasbourg did much about it. We viewed it more as an irritation. And yet over the last 6 months and more, I've become very heavily involved in lobbying against the Chinese Communist Party, against this regime, against Huawei's involvement in this network. And I'm struck that those of us that are Sino-sceptics have been doing this from the perspective that economically, ultimately, China is bad for us. It undercuts us. It costs jobs. In security terms, it is madness, something that the Australians, the Americans, and many others have woken up to. And we've not been making the argument properly and fully about the plight of the Falun Gong, the plight of the Uighurs, about the brutal, truthful fact that it is utterly right to compare the way the Chinese government treats minorities, treats different points of view within its country. It is utterly right to compare that with what the National Socialists did between 1933 and 1945. There is a form of state-sponsored genocide that is going on in China, and myself included, we have done too little to expose this. Now, to my delight and surprise, the Andrew Marr show, and gosh, I had a proper confrontation with him last year. The Andrew Marr show did today have the Chinese ambassador on and did start to ask some of these questions. But you know something? The general public just do not realise how appalling this Chinese regime is, how truly vile it is. We've got to make them understand it. As for our future policy, I do not want our universities to be dependent upon Chinese students and money. I don't want us buying our antibiotics to go on buying 80% of them from China. As for Boris, well, as we've seen with Huawei, whatever his instincts are, he's actually not particularly principled about these things, and he can be shifted. But the real power lies with you. Whether China becomes, as it wants to be, the dominant global state as we go through the 21st century or not, all of it depends on you. If you go on buying Chinese goods, this evil regime will get richer and will spread itself across, and yes, I mean it, become the dominant player in the world. So it's up to us. It's not easy to avoid buying products made in China. Mind you, most of it's rubbish anyway. It's not easy, but that is what we've got to do. Wake up, everybody. And if you've got younger members of your family who scream with horror if somebody says something that they think is transphobic or homophobic or racist, they really are desperately upset by offence that can be caused by words that are said. Well, point them not just to words, but to what this Chinese regime is doing to millions of people in its own country. We need to wake up a younger generation to how simply awful China is and how physical actions are more serious than words that might cause offence. Thank you.